leaving our children at risk for further abuse. In addition to this lack of collaboration, some service providers fail to assist abused children. The study traces reported child abuse and neglect cases through the child protection system to identify and describe the challenges that are preventing children from receiving quality and timely protection services. Well, Lucy Jamieson is a senior researcher on that study, and she joins us live now from our Cape Town studios. Good afternoon, Lucy, and thank you for your time on the SABC News Desk.
Good afternoon.
Lucy, can you give us a sense of how an abused or neglected child will experience our child protection system?
Well, first of all, it's important to note that most children who've experienced an abuse and neglect never get that far. You know, in society, we don't like to talk about abuse and neglect, and it's very difficult for children to come forward in the first place. And one of the things that we found is that, particularly around physical abuse, when children present to police stations, they're often turned away and told that they've been violated in the name of discipline. So they're not taken seriously. That's the first troubling thing that we see with a child protection system. And of course, they should get a caring, responsive welcome, and they should be listened to, but they're not. So that's the first thing that's worrying. Secondly, there are lots of protocols that are in place that guide what social workers, police officers, health professionals are supposed to do when a child discloses abuse. And sadly, in many cases, those protocols are not being followed, so that children experience delays, files get lost. We find that in government social service offices that 44% of cases were all they could find in terms of the paperwork. That means that they lost over half of the files. Now, those are real children and real families that are in distress and that need assistance, but we can't even find them. That's terrible.
Lucy, your study clearly points to a clear lack of coordination between the three main response units, being in the SAPS, social services and pathology services. Talk us through that.
So, one of the problems is that services are overburdened and we are not spending enough money in order to ensure that there are enough professionals who are working in the child protection system. So, for example, I mean, when the Children's Act was passed, government did a costing, and that they are only contributing a minimum of 50% of what their own costing showed it would take to run these services. So let's be fair, you know, police officers, social workers, health professionals are overburdened. Now, when you're overburdened, you've got to try and prioritise, and they're struggling to keep up with the demand of those cases. And it means that they're not finding the time to talk to each other, to meet regularly, and to go through the cases. So the children end up not getting proper home visits where their situation is assessed. We're not investigating properly, which means many offenders are released back into the community where they continue to pose a risk to the child that's been identified as having been abused, and of course to other children. We're not making their homes safe. The role of social service professionals is to work with families in order to help them to create a safer environment for children. That's not happening. We're not doing effective assessments. And most worryingly, we're supposed to ensure that children receive therapeutic services so that they are able to recover from the psychological trauma. But we find that most children are not accessing any kind of therapy at all. Now, that's tragic news for the individual child, but remember that violence and trauma breed further violence and trauma. So children who go left untreated means that there's a greater risk that they themselves will either continue to accept violence in their own lives or perpetrate violence against their own children and future generations. So if we don't respond, we're creating a bigger problem for ourselves in the future.
Lucy, the last time you and I spoke on the show was about a year ago, when you were busy with the Mandela Initiative Action Dialogue, when you were trying to form a better intersectoral collaboration plan on preventing violence against children and then improving on that plan for the new year. What's the status of that plan right now?
Well, I'm happy to report that, a plan of action has been drafted and is at present being consulted on. So the Department of Social Development are out in every single province talking to parents, talking to the organisations that provide services for both children and for women who've experienced abuse. So there has been progress. Obviously, we would like to see that happen faster. We need to make sure that we've got the policies but also the services in place. So forward, but not fast enough.
Lucy Jamieson, Senior Researcher at UCT's Children's Institute, thank you for joining us from our Cape Town studios this International Children's Day. Time to take a short break. Peter and I will be back with more news after